"Sir, please, Mama's still in the house," they said, and he froze with the puppy in his hands. The rancher had only bent down to lift the muddy little puppy from the ditch, brushing soot from its trembling fur, when two small voices cracked through the smoke-thickened afternoon. "Sir, please, Mama's still in the house!" And he froze mid-movement, the puppy dangling from his hands as the entire world snapped from ordinary dust and chores into raw, breath-stealing crisis. The children, a boy no older than 7 and a girl whose braids were uneven from fear, ran toward him with their faces streaked in ash, their tiny boots skidding across the dry earth as they tugged desperately at the hem of his coat, pulling him around to face the single-story cabin behind them, where smoke billowed from the broken windows like a dying animal gasping for air. The rancher felt his heartbeat slam once, hard enough to hurt, because fire was not a stranger on the prairie, but the sight of children pleading for their mother inside a collapsing house hit him in a place he'd spent years boarding shut, a place where his own brother once whispered from behind a wall of flame he couldn't reach in time. And for a split second his knees weakened as memory and present terror clashed inside him. The puppy whimpered in his grip, squirming in fear as the cabin crackled, its dry timber hissing under the heat, while smoke rolled out in thick, choking waves that stung his eyes, and he forced himself to look at the children, at the way the girl pressed both hands against her mouth to stop her sobs, and the boy's shoulders shook with a panic he was trying too hard to swallow. He swallowed hard himself because he could hear the fire changing pitch, a warning that the roof was close to giving. He started to step toward the cabin, but his boots halted on instinct as another beam inside snapped with a sound like a rifle shot, sending sparks shooting into the air, and the rancher felt that familiar horror clutch his spine. The terror of stepping into a fire too late. The fear of dragging out only regret. "She's in the back room," the boy cried, pointing with a shaking hand, and the rancher's jaw clenched so hard it ached, his breath sharp as he tried to see through the rolling smoke, knowing exactly how little time remained before the structure folded in on itself. More townsfolk gathered near the fence, unsure whether to help or simply watch, their hesitation slicing through him with a coldness he recognized from every tragedy where silence had cost lives. The girl tugged his sleeve again. "Please! She can't walk fast. She hurt her leg last winter." And something inside him snapped clean through, the memory of a voice he once couldn't save colliding with the two voices begging him now, and he gently set the puppy down on the ground before dropping to one knee so he could look the children in the eyes. Their terror was so raw it scraped the skin of his heart, and he didn't speak, didn't promise, didn't waste breath on anything fragile. He just nodded once, slow and steady, the kind of nod a child understands as a vow carved deeper than words. Then rose and took the first step toward the burning doorway, feeling the heat lick his face and the old fear pulling at his bones but forcing his legs forward anyway, because running toward fire had never been easy. But running away from those children would have been unforgivable. The rancher's first step toward the burning doorway felt like stepping back into a nightmare he had spent years burying, and for a heartbeat he almost halted again, not from cowardice, but from the ghost of a memory that clung to his ribs like barbed wire, the memory of another fire, another desperate cry, another moment where he'd arrived seconds too late. The cabin before him groaned under the strain of the flames chewing through its beams, and the smoke rolled out so thick it stung his eyes instantly, making him raise an arm to shield his face as the heat slammed into him with a force that blistered the air. Behind him, the children's voices trembled in the wind, the boy shouting, "Sir, please hurry!" while the girl sobbed into her hands, and those voices, thin, terrified, cracking like brittle twigs, latched onto the part of him that had never healed, the part that had never forgiven himself for a life lost long before this day. He reached the porch in 3 long strides, but as he grabbed the edge of the doorway, a blast of heat shot up his arm and forced him back a step, stealing his breath, and he staggered sideways, coughing as the smoke punched down his throat. The children cried out behind him, and the sound pierced him harder than any flame could. He tried again, ducking low, attempting to push through the choking darkness. But the moment he leaned in, the fire roared upward like a beast warding off an intruder, and a shower of sparks rained down where his head had been a second earlier, forcing him to throw himself backward onto the dirt. Townsfolk gathered now, 6 men and 2 women, hovering at a distance, muttering to each other about the danger, the collapsing roof line, the foolishness of going inside, and every word felt like a nail being hammered into the children's hope. He heard one man say, "She's gone already." Another mutter, "Ain't no sense dying for her." And the girl let out a small, broken sound that made his stomach twist with shame that grown men could speak so casually about abandoning a mother whose children were right there listening. The rancher forced himself up to his knees, wiping ash from his face, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs as he stared at the front room engulfed in flame, knowing he couldn't get through that way, and knowing equally well that any sane person would retreat before the collapsing roof sealed the mother's fate permanently. But sanity had nothing to do with the widening eyes of the boy who whispered, "Please, she's all we got." A plank near the window split open with a crack, spewing embers into the air, and the rancher's breath hitched as the memory he carried, the one he could never outrun, pressed against his mind until he felt sick. But when he turned and saw the girl clutching the puppy he had set down, holding it like something precious in a world falling apart, the decision he'd been wrestling with folded into a single, unshakable truth. He could not let these children watch another person they loved vanish into fire, while others stood back counting the reasons not to act. He planted one hand on the porch post, hauled himself to his feet, and scanned the cabin for another entrance, his jaw tightening with the resolve that had carried him through every hard winter on the prairie. Because even if fear still clawed at him, even if his lungs burned and his hands shook, those children needed someone who wouldn't retreat. And that someone, whether he felt ready or not, was him. He circled the side of the burning cabin with long, urgent strides, scanning for any gap the flames hadn't claimed yet, and the children followed several paces behind him. Too afraid to stay put, too terrified to get closer, calling out, "Mama!" between choking sobs, as smoke drifted low across the yard like a spreading curse. The rancher waved a hand for them to stop where the heat grew dangerous. But he didn't yell, didn't scold, didn't add any weight to the terror already crushing their small chests. He simply looked back once, meeting their eyes, and the silent message in that look made both children halt as if they'd been anchored to the earth. He scanned the back wall, then the adjacent window, where fire hadn't fully burst through yet. And when he cupped his hands around the glass to see inside, the heat burned his palms instantly, forcing him to pull back with a hiss. But the brief glimpse he caught, the faint shifting shadow beyond the smoke, was enough to snap his breath clean in half. She was alive. Or at least she had moved. He leaned in again, ignoring the sting on his skin, trying to see her shape through the swirling gray, and though her face was lost behind a haze of flames and darkness, he saw an arm, weakly dragging across the floor, and he jerked back as emotion slammed into him harder than the fire's heat. The children gasped behind him, their hope flaring as quickly and desperately as the flames eating through their home. And he turned toward them just long enough for them to see what he couldn't yet say, that their mother was still fighting. But the rancher didn't speak. He didn't dare make a promise flames could steal in seconds. Instead, he crouched, lowering himself so his eyes were level with theirs despite the smoke burning his lungs. And in that silence, shaken, breathless, carved from equal parts fear and resolve, they saw everything they needed. He wasn't giving up. The girl clutched the puppy tighter, as if drawing bravery from its trembling warmth, and the boy wiped his face with a dirty sleeve, nodding back at the rancher in a tiny, fierce gesture that stabbed him right in the ribs. Without a word, the rancher rose again and grabbed a nearby water trough bucket, splashing its contents across his shirt and hair with the practiced motion of a man who had done this before and hated every memory tied to it. The cold shock made him suck in a breath, grounding him against the roar of the flames. He braced his forearm against the window frame, tested its stability, then slammed his boot against the lower boards to loosen them. The kick sent sparks spraying upward, and he gritted his teeth against the heat, while prying the weakened planks free with a broken fence rail he found near the shed. The children watched with wide, trembling eyes, too frightened to speak, knowing instinctively that the silence between them mattered more than any shouted reassurance could. When he finally widened the window just enough for a man to squeeze through, he looked back at them one last time. Just a glance, but full of everything he didn't say. "Stay here. Don't follow. I'm going in." The boy nodded again, clutching his sister's hand so tightly she winced, and the girl whispered through her tears, "Please bring her out," her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. The rancher didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because the vow he needed to make couldn't be spoken in this world until it was fulfilled. So instead he lowered his head, drew one breath that burned all the way down, and climbed through the broken frame into the suffocating darkness where their mother waited. The moment the rancher slipped through the broken window frame, the heat swallowed him whole, wrapping around his lungs like a fist as smoke curled into his throat and made his eyes sting so violently he had to blink through tears just to keep the room's shapes from melting into nothing. Crouching low, he pressed one hand to the floorboards to steady himself, feeling how dangerously hot they'd become. And he moved slowly, not from hesitation, but from the careful calculation of someone who knew a collapsing room could kill faster than the flames themselves. The cabin's interior was a maze of shadows, half-eaten furniture, and pockets of orange light flickering like cruel signals of where the fire planned to spread next. And he fought the instinct to call out for her, because using his voice meant sacrificing precious breath he needed to push deeper into the burning room. Instead, he listened, straining past the roar of flames, the crack of timber, and the low moan of bending metal. For anything human, anything soft enough to belong to someone who had not given up. A faint cough answered him, so thin it barely reached above the fire's growl, but it was enough to make his pulse race as he crawled toward the sound, sweeping one arm through the smoke until his fingers brushed against fabric, then skin. Hot, trembling, but alive. And the relief hit him so sharply it felt like the air he'd been choking on suddenly cleared for a heartbeat before slamming back in again. "I've got you," he rasped without meaning to speak, but the words slipped out, raw and muffled, more instinct than language, and he slid his arms beneath her shoulders, trying to lift her, only to realize her right leg was pinned beneath a fallen timber that had crashed down when the roof above gave way. She gasped at the pressure, clutching weakly at his arm, her face streaked with soot, eyes dazed and fading in and out of awareness. The rancher gritted his teeth, tightening his grip as he studied the beam. Too heavy to lift fully, but not impossible to shift if he found leverage. And he scanned the floor until his hand closed around a chunk of the broken window frame he'd forced open earlier. Using it as a brace, he wedged it under the timber and leaned his weight onto it, muscles trembling as he forced the beam upward just enough to free her leg. She cried out softly, and he swallowed his own panic, sliding her out with one arm while bracing the beam with the other until the wood finally dropped back with a thud that rattled the floorboards. He didn't have time to check her injuries. The fire around them surged in angry bursts, and the smoke thickened into a choking curtain that made the back of the room disappear entirely. Lifting her into his arms, he stumbled toward the window, but a sudden flare blocked his path, flames shooting up the wall like a warning. He backed away, scanning for another route, and spotted a narrow gap between the dressers where the smoke rose slower. He crouched low, shifting her weight carefully to avoid jarring her leg, and pushed through the gap, every breath burning like inhaled sand until the faint rectangle of the window appeared again. Blurred, distant, but reachable. With a final surge of strength, he hoisted her toward the opening, shielding her face from the sparks as he pushed her through into the waiting hands outside. And the moment she disappeared into the world beyond the smoke, the cabin groaned above him with a deep, splitting crack that told him he had only seconds left to escape. The moment the mother's body vanished through the window frame into the waiting daylight, the rancher felt the building's entire weight shift above him, as if the house itself resented losing what it had tried so hard to claim. And a deep crack ripped through the beams overhead, showering him with sparks that burned along his neck like sharp, angry insects. He dropped to his knees instinctively, covering his head as a section of the ceiling sagged with a groan that vibrated through the floorboards, warning him he had mere seconds before the fire finished its work. The window, his only exit, was now choked with thick gray smoke pouring inward, blinding him to the outside world, except for the muffled cries of the children and the frantic shouts of neighbors who had found their courage too late. He crawled forward on elbows and palms, his eyes watering so hard he could barely distinguish where the floor ended and the wall began. And when he reached the window ledge, the smoke thickened into a swirling wall that made his lungs seize and his vision spin. He tried to stand, but the heat forced him lower, and for a terrifying heartbeat he felt the same helplessness that had claimed his brother years ago. The sensation of being swallowed by flame, of air turning to knives inside his chest, of knowing the world above might collapse before anyone realized he hadn't made it out. He pressed his forehead to the scorched wood, fighting panic as the room contracted into a tunnel of darkness. But somewhere just beyond the suffocating roar of the fire, he heard the boy shout, "Sir, you can do it! Please, come out!" And that voice, thin, shaking, full of belief he didn't think he deserved, cut through the fog in his mind and slammed into the part of him that refused to die in front of children begging for hope. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed the window frame and pulled himself upward, ignoring the sting of splinters embedding into his palms. But when he tried to hoist himself out, the back of his shirt caught on a jagged nail and yanked him sideways, slamming his ribs into the sill so hard he almost lost his grip. He let out a strangled grunt, tearing the fabric loose with a desperate twist as the cabin lurched again, dropping burning debris onto the space where he'd been seconds before. Hands reached through the smoke, blurred, frantic shapes, and someone shouted, "Grab him! Pull!" But the rancher couldn't see who it was. He only felt fingers close around his wrist and forearm, tugging with a strength fueled by terror rather than muscle. And he kicked against the floor, pushing upward with the last air in his lungs as the window's edge scraped along his spine. The smoke behind him turned darker, denser, almost solid, and he knew the cabin was seconds from collapsing entirely. He threw his weight forward, letting the unseen hands yank him through the frame, and the moment his chest cleared the opening, a blast of heat exploded behind him, pushing his boots through as if the fire itself was ejecting him. He fell hard onto the dirt, coughing so violently his entire body shook, and the boy immediately dropped beside him, patting his shoulder with both hands as though trying to wake him, while the girl clutched the puppy and whispered, "Please get up. Please," through trembling lips. He dragged in one ragged breath, then another, until the air finally reached a part of his lungs that didn't burn, and he rolled onto his side just in time to see the cabin's roof crash inward in a fiery cascade. Too late for anyone who might still have been inside, but not too late for the woman he had carried out, or the children who now knelt beside him, with tears turning tracks through the ash on their small faces. He pushed himself upright slowly, lungs still burning and vision swimming, but the children were already guiding him with small, urgent hands toward their mother, who lay propped against a water barrel where two neighbors had dragged her after he'd pushed her through the window. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, each rise of her chest a fragile victory. And when the rancher knelt beside her, she opened her eyes with the dazed confusion of someone pulled back from the edge of darkness. Ash clung to her hair, streaking through the strands like gray threads of the fire that had nearly devoured her. And when her gaze flicked toward her children, both clinging to her arms, crying softly, something soft and broken flickered inside her eyes, a mixture of relief and disbelief that she was alive to see their faces again. "Mama," the girl whispered, brushing soot from her mother's cheek, and the woman took in a sharp breath, reaching weakly for them despite her injured leg trembling under her skirt. The rancher watched her struggle to move, his chest tightening with the memory of how she'd clawed along the burning floor, refusing to surrender even when the fire tried to swallow her whole. And he swallowed hard as he shifted closer, unsure whether she'd welcome his presence or fear it after such terror. But when her gaze finally lifted to him, raw and unsteady, there was no fear. Only a quiet, stunned recognition that made his heart lurch in a way he couldn't explain. She parted her lips, as if to speak, but the words dissolved into a harsh cough, and he reached instinctively for the bucket beside her, helping her sip the thin trickle of water that remained in its bottom. Her hand shook as she steadied it, and when their fingers brushed, she startled, not from discomfort, but from the shock of finding gentleness in a moment when everything had been violence and flame. The children pressed tighter against her, trembling with aftershocks of fear, and the rancher shifted to kneel in front of all three of them, trying to offer his presence without crowding them, his breath still uneven as he wiped soot from his forehead with the back of his hand. The mother studied him, eyes drifting over the burns on his arms, the torn shirt, the ash that coated him like a second skin, and her lower lip trembled with a kind of gratitude too heavy for words. When she finally found her breath enough to whisper, it came out cracked and hoarse. You went in for me." And the disbelief carried inside those few words struck him harder than the smoke ever had. He shook his head slightly, not trusting his voice, but the girl spoke for him, her small voice steadying like dawn breaking over a long night. "He didn't even think, Mama. He just ran in." The mother swallowed hard, her gaze filling with tears she didn't let fall, and for a long, soft moment she simply held his eyes, as if trying to understand why a stranger would stake his life on hers when the world had given her little reason to expect such mercy. The puppy wriggled out of the girl's arms then, waddling over to the rancher and nuzzling his knee with a soft whine, and the absurd innocence of the moment tugged a breath from him he hadn't realized he was holding. The mother's breath shuddered again, but this time it wasn't pain. It was the fragile cracking of someone realizing after too many years of surviving alone, that help had found her when she least believed it would. And without thinking, without meaning to make it anything more than truth, she whispered his name, though he hadn't given it, softly, tenderly, like a prayer said in the hush between fire and dawn. By the time the mother could sit upright with the children tucked close against her sides, half the town had begun creeping out from behind fences and hitching posts, their faces still blotched with smoke and shame, as they whispered among themselves, unsure whether to approach or stay back. The rancher didn't look at them. He kept his focus on the family in front of him, checking the mother's injured leg with careful, calloused hands, making sure she could shift without collapsing, though he stayed far enough back that she could pull away if she needed to. The children clung to her shoulders, their small bodies shaking with aftershocks of fear, and she kept stroking their hair with trembling fingers, even though every movement sent a surge of pain up her wounded leg. The rancher saw her wince, but she tried to hide it behind a weak smile meant to calm her children, and something about that quiet strength settled deep into his chest, heavy and humbling. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the sheriff's deputy stepped forward, a man known more for laziness than courage, and he cleared his throat loudly as if trying to manufacture authority he didn't really possess. "Ma'am," he said awkwardly, "town policy says we need to know how the fire started." The mother stiffened, her arms tightening protectively around her children, and the rancher rose to his feet before she could answer, planting himself between her and the deputy with a posture as steady as an oak, not threatening, but unmistakably firm. The deputy raised both hands in surrender, muttering, "Easy now, I'm just asking," though his eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd, who seemed suddenly very interested in which way this confrontation might tilt. A few townsfolk whispered theories, accidental spark from the stove, careless ember, maybe a lightning strike from the night before. But one man in the back muttered something cruel under his breath about reckless widows, and the rancher's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached. He didn't move toward the man, didn't raise his voice, but he turned his head just enough for their eyes to meet, and the man fell silent immediately, shrinking back behind the others. The mother swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the deputy and the rancher, then down to her children, and when she finally found her voice, it was small, but steady. "The stovepipe cracked last winter. I patched it, but not well enough." The deputy scribbled something on a scrap of paper, but before he could respond, one of the older women in town stepped forward, a laundress with a spine bent from years of work but eyes sharp with judgment, and said loudly, "You told the landlord months ago the pipe needed fixing." The mother blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting anyone to speak in her defense, and another voice joined in. "Aye, and he said he'd get around to it after harvest. Never did." The crowd shifted, discomfort spreading as guilt rose like smoke among them. The rancher felt the mother lean slightly against the barrel, exhaustion pulling at her posture, and he knelt again beside her without thinking, checking the swelling in her ankle and murmuring, "Don't move too much," in a tone gentler than he'd used in years. The children pressed closer to him as if proximity alone brought safety, and the crowd watched the moment unfold with a mixture of awe and something deeper, respect, reluctant but growing. The deputy finally pocketed his paper and said, voice softer now, "You and your kids can stay in the meeting hall tonight. Town'll sort the rest out in the morning." But the rancher didn't wait for morning. He met the mother's eyes, reading the fear she didn't voice, the fear of sleeping under a roof that wasn't hers, the fear of depending on people who had done nothing when the fire first began. And he said quietly, "You're not staying in a hall." The mother stared at him, startled, but he nodded once, slow, and resolute. "You're coming with me." And for the first time, the crowd didn't object. They stepped back and let the choice belong to her. The rancher didn't wait for the deputy's approval or the crowd's murmurs to settle. Instead, he gently slid one arm beneath the mother's knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her with a steadiness that made the children gasp and then cling even tighter to his coat as they followed beside him, unwilling to let even a step separate them from the man who had walked into fire for their family. The mother stiffened at first, startled by the sudden closeness, but when the movement jostled her injured leg and she clutched his shirt out of sheer instinct, he slowed his pace, adjusting his grip with a softness that made her breath catch as something inside her, a long-buried instinct to brace against roughness, hesitated, then loosened just enough for her to rest her cheek against his shoulder. Townsfolk stepped aside as he carried her down the road, clearing a path they hadn't offered when flames were clawing up the cabin walls, their expressions shifting from shame to something quieter, heavier, as if they'd just realized how much courage looked like when it wasn't dressed in a badge or strutting behind a gun belt. The deputy jogged awkwardly behind them, insisting he needed to file something official, but the rancher ignored him entirely, focusing only on keeping the woman steady in his arms and the children close enough that they never felt lost in the crowd. When they reached the small rise near the old well, where the ridge gave a full view of the smoldering remains of the cabin, the mother finally lifted her head, eyes glazing as she gazed at the ruins of the place she had fought to keep standing for her children. Her lips trembled, her fingers digging into his shoulder, and for a moment she closed her eyes as if absorbing the fact that everything she owned, everything she'd saved, everything she'd patched and repatched through storms and loneliness had disappeared in a few violent breaths of flame. The rancher didn't speak. He simply shifted his stance so she didn't bear the weight of the moment alone, holding her as if her grief had a physical form that could be steadied if someone was strong enough to share it. The children stood close to his boots, wiping at their tears with ash-streaked hands, and the puppy nudged the boy's ankle with a tentative whine, offering the small comfort creatures give without understanding why the world has collapsed. When they resumed walking, the mother's voice finally broke through the quiet, cracked and trembling. "I have nowhere, no money, nothing for them." The rancher stopped at the base of the hill, adjusting her weight so she could see his face, and though soot still streaked across his jaw and exhaustion lined every inch of him, his eyes held a steadiness that didn't waver. "You have them," he said softly, "and now you have a place to go." She swallowed hard, her breath hitching as her gaze flicked between him and her children, who looked up at her with wide, trembling hope, as if they were afraid she might still refuse safety out of habit. "My home isn't much," he added, voice low enough the crowd couldn't hear. "But it's safe. That's what matters tonight." The girl stepped forward, gripping his pant leg with both hands, her voice small but firm. "Please, Mama, please say yes." And the mother, exhausted, shaken, stripped of everything except the children she loved more fiercely than fear itself, finally nodded once. Tiny, fragile, but real. The rancher exhaled, a slow breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and he turned toward the open prairie road leading to his ranch. Behind them, the crowd watched not with doubt or judgment, but with the quiet recognition that something important had shifted, not just in the ashes of the fire, but in the beating center of the small family, now walking away from it. The road to the ranch stretched long and uneven beneath their feet, the prairie wind brushing ash from their clothes with each step, while the sky overhead deepened into a blue so quiet It felt almost out of place after the chaos they'd survived. The rancher kept the mother securely in his arms, adjusting his grip whenever her breath hitched, while the children walked so close to him their shoulders nearly brushed his boots, as though distance of any kind felt dangerous now that the world had shown how quickly everything could burn away. When they reached the split in the road, one path leading to town, the other tracing a soft curve toward his small ranch at the edge of the cottonwood grove, the mother tensed slightly, her fingers curling against the fabric of his torn shirt, and he slowed just enough for her to see the land ahead. A modest stretch of fenced pasture, a two-room cabin with smoke gently rising from a chimney instead of roaring out of shattered windows, and a corral gate swinging lazily in the wind. It wasn't much, not impressive, not grand, not even particularly tidy, but it was safe, and her eyes softened with something like disbelief at the sight of a home still standing after watching her own collapse into flame. He carried her up the short path while the children ran ahead, calling out excitedly as if claiming the open space with every step, their small shadows stretching across the ground like a promise the land had never been asked to hold before. The rancher eased her down onto the wooden bench beside his door, moving slowly so her injured leg wouldn't jar against the worn planks, and she let out a trembling breath as her fingers brushed the smooth wood, the first solid thing she'd touched all day that wasn't burning, collapsing, or tearing itself apart. The puppy scrambled onto her lap, curling into the folds of her skirt as though declaring her its rightful person, and for a fleeting second she laughed. Weak, breathy, but real. And the sound made the rancher go still, as if he'd stumbled into hearing something sacred. The children ran circles around the yard, pointing at the water pump, the stack of chopped wood, the old wagon wheel leaning against the shed, and each time they discovered something new, they turned to their mother to make sure she saw it too. She watched them with eyes that softened further, her shoulders releasing tension she'd been carrying since before the fire. And when the rancher sat beside her, she didn't flinch or shift away. She simply breathed him into the space, as though his presence had become part of the fragile safety forming around them. The deputy arrived moments later, dismounting with a self-important huff as he pulled out yet another scrap of paper, calling out, "I still need names for the report." But the rancher's glare alone made the man stop mid-sentence, swallow, and tuck the paper back into his vest. "Right," the deputy muttered, climbing onto his horse again. "I'll, sort it myself." The children giggled, the first unbroken sound of relief since the fire, and the mother touched her chest, as if steadying herself against the strange swell of gratitude rising inside her. The rancher didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he rose, walked into the cabin, and returned with a blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and soap, draping it around her shoulders with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. When he knelt to check her leg again, cradling her ankle with careful hands, the boy leaned against his side as if seeking warmth, and the girl rested her head on the rancher's shoulder without hesitation. The mother watched this, watched her children choose him without fear, and her eyes welled with tears she'd held back all day, tears that finally slid free as she whispered, voice raw and full, "You didn't just save me." The rancher looked up, surprised, and she finished in a trembling breath, "You saved all of us." And for the first time, he didn't look away. The night settled over the ranch in a quiet that felt earned, not borrowed, the kind of stillness that wrapped gently around the edges of a day spent outrunning fire and fear. Inside the small cabin, the mother lay on the rancher's bed while her children slept curled on either side of her, their soot-streaked faces finally peaceful as the puppy snored in a tiny heap at their feet. The rancher sat in the lone chair beside the bed, back straight despite exhaustion dragging at every part of him, his eyes scanning the room as if making sure no shadow could turn into danger, no sound into a threat. And when the mother stirred, he was immediately at her side, adjusting the blanket so her injured leg stayed warm. She blinked through the dim lamplight, her gaze landing on him with a softness that surprised them both, and for a moment she simply watched him. Watched the way he kept checking the window, the door, the stove, as if protecting them had woven itself into his instincts long before she ever collapsed into his arms. "You should sleep," she whispered, voice hoarse but steady. He shook his head, not in stubbornness, but in quiet certainty. "I will, when you do." The simplicity of the answer, without obligation, without expectation, made her chest tighten, and she studied him through the haze of exhaustion, taking in the dirt smudged along his jaw, the burns reddening his forearms, the torn shirt revealing bruises beneath. And something deep in her heart recognized the truth no one else had ever given her. He hadn't saved her for admiration or reward. He had saved her because he couldn't bear the thought of those children losing their mother the way he once lost someone he never spoke about. Outside, the first hint of dawn crept across the horizon, a pale gold line stretching like a promise across the sky, and the rancher rose quietly, stepping onto the porch to breathe the cool air that washed away the last traces of smoke from his lungs. When he turned back toward the doorway, he saw her watching him, propped on one elbow, her expression open in a way it hadn't been earlier. Less guarded, less afraid, more aware of the strange, fragile thread that had begun weaving between them long before she'd realized she was safe. The children woke moments later, blinking sleepily before scrambling off the bed and racing toward the rancher with bright, breathless relief, hugging him so fiercely he staggered a step. He steadied himself, laughing under his breath as he knelt to gather them close, and the mother covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by how naturally her children fit against a man who had been a stranger only hours before. When he helped her outside so she could feel the morning air, she leaned against him just enough for him to bear her weight, and the children walked in front of them, pointing at the sunrise as if it belonged to them now. She gazed at the land, then at him, and said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head again, just as he had earlier. "You don't owe me anything." Her eyes softened, filling with the kind of gratitude words couldn't hold. "But you gave us everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't take anything that wasn't freely offered, but when she slid her fingers into his, slow and uncertain, he closed his hand around hers with the gentlest certainty she had ever known. And there, in the rising light of a morning that felt like a second chance for all of them, the rancher stood with the woman he had carried from fire and the children who had chosen him without needing to be asked. And for the first time in a long, long while, the dawn felt like a beginning instead of something to survive. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did or walked on? Tell us in the comments.